The wind howled through the frozen streets, snow swirling like ghosts in the night. A German shepherd stood motionless at the millionaire's doorstep, her body shielding two shivering pups. Eyes hollow with desperation, she didn't move, just waited, watching, pleading. Martin stepped away from the window, rubbing a hand down his face, trying to shake off the strange feeling crawling over him. Why was she just standing there? Any other stray would be barking, scratching, desperate for attention. But this one, she was different. She wasn't demanding help. She was waiting for a choice to be made. The storm outside intensified, the snow thickening, turning the world into a swirling white abyss. If he ignored them, they wouldn't last the night. The mansion's gates were high, the land vast. There was nowhere else for them to go. His jaw tightened. Not my problem. He turned away, back toward the desk, back toward the comfort of whiskey and the fire's warmth. He had spent years hardening himself against emotion, against attachment, against anything that could remind him of what he had lost. Why should tonight be any different? But then, another sound. Not a whimper this time. A different noise altogether. Silence. Martin exhaled slowly, forcing himself to ignore the feeling twisting in his gut. It's just a dog. It wasn't as if opening the door would undo anything that had happened in his past. It wouldn't bring back the life he had lost. And yet, his fingers twitched against the desk, betraying him, as if some forgotten part of himself still wanted to act. He turned sharply, his feet moving before his mind had even decided. Before he could stop himself, he was striding across the hall, past towering paintings and cold marble floors. The foyer was dimly lit, the grand chandelier above casting a soft golden glow over the entrance. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. Once you open it, there's no turning back. For a brief second, he almost walked away. He almost let the past win, let the ice in his veins keep him locked away in his fortress of indifference. But then, he gritted his teeth and turned the handle. A gust of freezing air blasted into the warmth of the house, but the shepherd didn't flinch. She simply lifted her head, watching him, not with fear, not with desperation, but with something else, something he wasn't ready to name. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Then, the smallest movement. The dog took a step forward, pressing the pups closer to her body. A decision had been made. And for the first time in years, Martin Holloway realized he was no longer the one in control. The storm pressed against the open door, the wind carrying a biting cold that wrapped around Martin Holloway like a phantom from his past. He stood frozen, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other curled into a fist at his side. The German shepherd remained still, her amber eyes locked onto his. She didn't lunge forward, didn't cower. She simply waited. Martin clenched his jaw. He knew what was happening. This wasn't just about a stray dog seeking shelter. This was a test. A battle between the man he had become and the man he once was. The man he had buried beneath years of wealth, loss, and solitude. The pups shivered beneath their mother's frame, their tiny bodies curled into the frozen ground. They wouldn't last the night. Martin exhaled sharply and stepped aside. "Come in," he muttered, barely recognizing his own voice. The shepherd hesitated for only a moment before nudging the pups forward. They stumbled, their little legs unsteady against the ice, but she guided them carefully, never once taking her eyes off Martin. She didn't trust him yet. He could see it in the way her muscles tensed, in the way she stayed close to her young. The moment they crossed the threshold, the warmth of the house wrapped around them. The contrast was stark, the icy death waiting outside, and the unfamiliar safety within. Martin closed the door. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with something unspoken. The fire from the study cast a faint golden glow down the hallway, and for the first time, Martin noticed just how frail the pups were. Their fur was damp, clumped with ice, and their ribs pressed against their fragile skin. The shepherd lowered her head, sniffing the air cautiously, her ears twitching at every sound. She was waiting for something. Perhaps for him to send them back into the storm. Perhaps for something worse. Martin turned away, raking a hand through his graying hair. He hadn't planned for this. He wasn't a man who took in strays. And yet, here they were. His pulse ticked at his temple as he moved through the house, pulling open a closet door. He reached inside, yanking out an old blanket, a relic from a life that once was. A deep green quilt, frayed at the edges, Claire's favorite. His throat tightened as he walked back toward the shepherd, tossing the blanket onto the floor beside the fireplace. The pups hesitated, their tiny noses twitching as they took in the unfamiliar scent. But the shepherd nudged them forward, watching Martin carefully as they settled into the warmth. For the first time, he noticed her paws. Cracked. Bleeding. Something twisted in his chest. "I don't even know why I'm doing this," he muttered under his breath, turning away before the warmth in his chest could grow into something dangerous. He poured himself another drink. The hours bled into the night. Martin tried to ignore them, tried to pretend that the presence of a starving dog and her pups didn't shift something in the very foundation of his home. But he couldn't. From the corner of his eye, he caught glimpses of them. The pups nestled together, their tiny bodies rising and falling with the soft rhythm of sleep. The shepherd, though exhausted, remained alert, her head resting on her paws, eyes flicking toward every movement Martin made. She didn't trust him. And maybe she was right not to. He wasn't the man she needed him to be. Martin downed the rest of his whiskey and turned toward the window, watching as the snow continued its relentless assault against the world outside. If he had left them out there, they would have died. The thought settled deep, gnawing at the edges of something he had long since buried. Loss. Regret. Memories he had no right revisiting clawed their way to the surface. Claire's laughter, once the melody of this house, had been replaced by silence. The way she used to curl up beside him on the couch, tucked beneath that same green blanket, her tiny hands gripping the fur of their old family dog. Bailey. God, he hadn't thought about her in years. A golden retriever, aging and slow, but fiercely loyal. She had been Claire's protector, her shadow, following her through the halls like she was guarding the very heart of the Holloway estate. And when Claire had... Martin shut his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples. Number not tonight. The shepherd let out a soft huff, shifting her weight slightly. Martin turned toward her. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. She blinked, silent, watching. A long exhale escaped his lips. "I don't even know what I'm doing," he muttered, rubbing his hands down his face. He hadn't cared for anything in a long time, hadn't let himself feel anything in a long time. And yet, here he was, standing in a room that suddenly didn't feel as empty as it had before. A sigh escaped him as he pushed away from the desk, walking toward the fireplace. He hesitated for a moment before crouching beside the blanket, watching as the pups snuggled deeper into the warmth. Their tiny breaths were even now, steady, safe. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, letting his fingers brush against the shepherd's paw. She stiffened. For a moment, he thought she would pull away, that she would snarl, reminding him that she had survived without the kindness of men like him. But she didn't. Instead, she held still. And then, with the smallest movement, she leaned into his touch. Martin's chest tightened. Something had shifted, not just in the room, not just in her, but in him. Bottom of form. The next morning, Martin woke to an unfamiliar sound. For years, his mornings had been defined by silence. No voices, no footsteps, nothing but the distant hum of an empty house. But now there was movement. Small, shuffling sounds against the hardwood floors. He pushed himself up, groggy, his body protesting from a restless sleep in his study chair. His gaze fell toward the fireplace, where the shepherd lay curled around her pups, shielding them as if the warmth of the house still wasn't something she trusted. Martin sighed, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't meant for them to stay. That wasn't the plan. But what was the plan? To put them back out into the cold? He stood, stretching as he moved toward the kitchen. His footsteps echoed through the house, the shepherd's ears twitching at the sound, but she didn't move. She was still watching him. Always watching. Pulling open the fridge, Martin frowned. What do dogs even eat? He hadn't had a pet since Claire was alive. He scanned the contents: wine, overpriced cheeses, leftovers he never touched. Nothing useful. His gaze drifted to the pantry, and after a moment's hesitation, he grabbed a loaf of bread and some milk. He poured a shallow bowl, placed it on the floor, then set a plate of torn bread beside it. It wasn't much, but it was something. He turned back toward the shepherd. "You need to eat," he muttered. She didn't move. Martin exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, I'm not keeping you. Just take what you need and go." The shepherd held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, she rose, her movements stiff but precise. Her pups stirred, mewling softly as they lost their warmth. She padded toward the bowl, sniffed at the milk, then lowered her head and lapped at it cautiously. Something about the sight of it, the way she approached the food like it was a trick, like kindness was something she had never known, bothered him. Martin turned away before the feeling could settle too deep. He didn't have time for this. Not now, not ever. The day passed in a haze of routine. Conference calls, financial reports, meetings he barely paid attention to. And yet, his mind wasn't in any of it. It was downstairs, in the quiet warmth of the fireplace. By evening, he found himself back in the study, staring at the shepherd as she lay curled beside her pups. The fire cast soft shadows along her sleek fur, her breathing deep and steady. The pups twitched in their sleep, safe. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something dangerously close to attachment. And that was a problem. Because attachment meant pain. And pain? Pain was something he had sworn never to feel again. He forced himself to look away, to steel his resolve. "I'll take you to a shelter tomorrow," he murmured, as if saying it aloud would make it easier. The shepherd didn't react, but something told him she already knew, and that knowledge settled like a stone in his chest. Morning came too soon. The storm had passed, leaving the estate covered in an untouched blanket of snow. The world outside looked pure, fresh, deceptively peaceful. Martin pulled on his coat, grabbing his keys. He had called ahead. The local shelter had space. It was the logical decision, the right decision. He stepped into the study, clearing his throat. "All right, let's go." The shepherd lifted her head, ears twitching. The pups squirmed beneath her, whimpering softly. Martin hesitated. She didn't move. Did she understand? A strange pressure settled in his chest. This was what needed to be done. He had no business keeping them here. He wasn't the type of man who cared for things. And yet, his grip on the keys tightened. And then, the phone rang. Martin exhaled sharply, yanking it from his pocket. "Holloway!" he barked. A voice filled the line, urgent. "Mr. Holloway, this is Stephen from City Security. We need your authorization immediately. There's been an incident on the estate." Martin stiffened. What kind of incident? There was a pause. Then, "A break-in, sir. We have reason to believe they were after something valuable." Martin's blood ran cold. The mansion was supposed to be untouchable. Every door, every window, every entrance secured with state-of-the-art systems. If someone had gotten in, they knew what they were doing. He turned toward the shepherd, his pulse ticking at his temple. She had been outside all night before he let her in. Watching. Waiting. Had she been running from something? Or someone? Martin's grip on the phone tightened. "Lock the perimeter. I'll be there in 5. His plans had just changed, and somehow he had a feeling so had his life. The cold seeped into Martin's bones as he stepped outside, the fresh snow crunching beneath his boots. The air was sharp, the silence around the estate unnerving. Security lights cast long shadows over the pristine white, illuminating the footprints of the guards who had already begun their sweep of the perimeter. Martin pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath misting in the freezing air. The estate had always been a fortress, a place where no one could reach him. Not the outside world, not the past, not the weight of his own regrets. And yet, someone had tried to break in. Stephen, the head of security, met him near the gates, his expression tight with unease. "Sir, we found tracks leading from the southern tree line. Whoever it was, they were careful. No sign of forced entry. They knew where the cameras were, knew how to avoid them." Martin's stomach twisted. "Did they take anything?" Stephen shook his head. "Not that we can tell, but they weren't just looking for valuables. There are signs that someone was watching the house, for days." Martin's fingers curled into fists, watching, waiting. His gaze drifted toward the mansion, the shepherd, the pups. Had they been running from something all along? A chill that had nothing to do with the snow ran down his spine. "I want a full sweep of the estate," he ordered. "Find out how close they got." Stephen hesitated. "Sir, that's not all." Martin's pulse ticked at his temple. "What?" Stephen turned, leading him toward a section of the property near the back entrance. A small patch of trees stood there, skeletal in the winter air. The guards had already marked the area with flashlights, revealing a disturbing sight. Footsteps, a trail leading toward the house, but more unsettling. They stopped, abruptly, as if whoever had been standing there had simply vanished. Martin's jaw clenched. A gut feeling, one he hadn't listened to in years, told him the truth. They hadn't vanished. They had been watching. For her. The shepherd. He turned sharply, heading back toward the house, his mind racing. His own past was full of people who had wanted something from him. Business rivals, ex-partners, people who had seen his wealth as something to take. But this wasn't about him. This was about her. A dog didn't just sit outside a mansion in the middle of a blizzard by chance. She'd been waiting for something, or running from someone. And now they had followed her here. Martin stormed through the front doors, shaking off the snow as he moved through the hallway. His heart pounded as he stepped into the study. The fire had burned low, casting flickering light against the walls. The shepherd was still there, curled protectively around her pups. But now, her eyes were open. Watching him. Martin exhaled, kneeling beside her, his hands resting on his thighs. "Who are you running from?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The shepherd didn't move. But the look in her eyes was not just instinct, not just fear. It was knowing. A deep, unshakable understanding that danger was coming. And for the first time in years, Martin realized something terrifying. He wasn't just protecting them. They were here to save him too. A storm of a different kind was coming. Martin could feel it. The weight of something shifting in the air, pressing against his chest like an unseen force. He had spent his life making decisions with precision, controlling every outcome, ensuring that nothing and no one could threaten what he had built. But now, he was standing in his own home, facing a truth he didn't want to admit. Someone had come looking for this dog, and if they were willing to trespass onto his estate in the middle of the night, they wouldn't stop now. Martin ran a hand through his hair, his mind working through every possibility. Who? Why? The shepherd had arrived at his doorstep with 2 helpless pups, starving, freezing. Not a stray, not an accident. She had been running, and whoever she had escaped from wanted her back. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the heavy silence of the study. The shepherd's golden eyes never left his. For the first time, Martin realized just how much intelligence was behind them. She wasn't just surviving. She understood. A soft whimper broke the silence. One of the pups stirred against her, tiny legs kicking out as if trapped in a dream. The mother curled tighter around them, pressing her nose against their small bodies in reassurance. Martin's chest tightened. Something about the way she held them, a silent promise of protection, made something inside him ache. He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. I should call animal control. That was the rational choice, the easy choice. But the easy choice had never felt so wrong. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Stephen's voice was firm, urgent. "Sir, we have a problem." Martin moved swiftly, pulling the door open. "What is it?" Stephen's expression was grim. "There's a man at the front gate. Says he's here for the dog." A cold dread settled in Martin's stomach. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a stray looking for shelter. This was a chase, and Martin was standing in the middle of it. By the time he reached the front gate, the snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes. The air was bitterly cold, but Martin barely noticed. His focus was locked on the man standing just beyond the iron bars. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a thick black coat, his hands shoved into his pockets as he stared up at the mansion. His face was partially obscured by the hood pulled low over his eyes, but there was something off about him. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't shifting his weight in the cold. He was still, waiting. Stephen stood beside Martin, his posture rigid, one hand resting near the radio clipped to his belt. "He claims the dog belongs to him." Martin didn't look away from the figure beyond the gate. "And does he have proof?" Stephen exhaled. "Number just a story." Martin finally spoke, his voice cutting through the frozen air. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Just someone looking for what's mine." Martin's fingers curled at his sides. "That dog came here starving, half frozen. If she was yours, you didn't take very good care of her." The man chuckled, but the sound was devoid of humor. "She's a fighter, always has been." Martin's gut twisted. The way he said it. The way his voice wrapped around those words like they meant something else entirely. Fighter, not pet, not companion. Martin had built his life around instinct, and every part of him was screaming that this man wasn't just a former owner looking for a lost dog. He was something worse. Martin took a step closer, his breath misting between them. "She's not going anywhere." For the first time, the man's expression shifted. The easy amusement faded, something darker slithering into his gaze. "She doesn't belong to you," he murmured. Martin didn't blink. "She does now." The two men stood in silence, the cold biting between them. Then the man exhaled through his nose, as if barely containing some deep frustration. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Enjoy her while you can." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the falling snow. Martin remained still, watching until the darkness swallowed him completely. A warning had just been given, and Martin knew better than to ignore it. Back inside, Martin locked the doors. He moved through the house with quick, precise steps, his mind calculating every possibility. Whoever that man was, he wasn't done. The shepherd lifted her head as he entered the study, her eyes sharp, alert. She knew. Martin knelt beside her, his voice lower now, steady. "He's coming back, isn't he?" She didn't move, didn't blink, but the way she held his gaze, unwavering, was all the answer he needed. Martin cursed under his breath. He had built a life free of attachments, free of things that could be taken from him. And now, in the span of 48 hours, he had something worth protecting. He exhaled sharply and stood. If the man returned, Martin would be ready. Because no one was taking them away. Not now. Not ever. The weight of the man's words clung to Martin long after he had disappeared into the snow. Enjoy her while you can. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Martin had faced powerful men before. He had built his empire against those who wanted to see him fail. But this was different. This wasn't business. This wasn't a calculated game of money and power. This was something primal, something dangerous. Martin stepped into the study, his fingers tightening into fists. The fire had burned low, flickering shadows across the walls. The shepherd lifted her head, ears twitching at his approach. She had sensed it. She knew he would come back. Martin knelt beside her, his voice steady. "I don't know what you've been through," he murmured. "I don't know what he did to you, but I'm not letting him take you back." She held his gaze, unwavering. The pups stirred beside her, their small bodies pressing into her warmth. Innocent. Unaware of the danger that loomed just beyond the walls of the mansion. Martin had built this house to keep himself untouchable, and yet, for the first time in years, he felt something worth defending. His thoughts were cut short by a noise, a metallic click, the sound of a gate unlocking. Martin snapped to his feet, heart hammering against his ribs. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see through the frost-covered glass. A dark figure stood near the perimeter of the property. Not the man from before. Someone else. His stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. Martin turned sharply. "Stephen!" Within seconds, the head of security entered, gun holstered at his hip. "Sir?" Martin gestured toward the window. "We have company." Stephen moved swiftly, pressing a hand to his radio. "Northwest perimeter. Movement detected. Confirm status." Static. A long, tense silence. Then, "We've got 2 unidentifieds, moving toward the service entrance, requesting immediate—" A crash. The radio cut out. Stephen's face darkened. "They're inside." Martin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth, cold steel, weighted in his grip. The shepherd growled, her hackles rising. She turned toward the door, muscles tensed, body coiled to fight. Martin met Stephen's gaze. "We hold them here." Stephen nodded, unholstering his weapon. "Yes, sir." The house fell silent, and then footsteps, slow, measured, moving through the hall like they belonged there. Martin's grip tightened around the poker. The shepherd stepped forward, standing beside him. No fear, no hesitation. Whoever was coming, they weren't leaving unscathed. The door to the study creaked. Martin's pulse pounded in his ears. He could hear them. 2 sets of footsteps, moving just outside. They weren't in a hurry. They thought they were in control. Martin's lips curled. They had no idea what they were walking into. A shadow passed beneath the doorframe. The shepherd snarled. A hand touched the knob, and Martin moved. The door burst open as he swung the poker with all his strength. It connected with bone, a sickening crack as the intruder staggered back with a pained grunt. Stephen stepped forward, gun raised. "Don't move!" The second intruder, dressed in all black, his face obscured by a mask, lunged. A knife glinted in the dim light. Martin twisted, knocking the blade aside, but the force sent him stumbling. The shepherd leaped. Her jaws snapped around the masked man's arm. A scream tore through the air as she clamped down, dragging him to the ground. Martin didn't hesitate. He drove the poker into the man's ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. The shepherd didn't release her grip. She held firm, teeth sinking deeper. The man thrashed beneath her, panic setting in. "Call them off," he gasped. Martin knelt beside him, his voice dangerously low. "She's not mine to command." The shepherd's growl rumbled through the room. She wasn't letting go. Stephen pressed his gun to the intruder's temple. "Start talking." The man wheezed, pain evident in his eyes. We were sent to bring the dog back." Martin's blood ran cold. "Why?" The man's gaze flickered toward his partner, still groaning on the floor. Hesitation. Martin's patience snapped. He grabbed the man by the collar, hauling him up. "Why?" he snarled. The man swallowed hard. "She's worth a fortune." Martin stiffened. "What?" The man coughed, wincing. The dog, the shepherd. She was bred for fights. Martin's stomach turned. She was part of an illegal ring, the man continued. But she fought back. Killed one of the dogs she was supposed to lose to. No one could break her after that. His voice lowered, his lips twisting into something almost like fear. She ran. No one's ever escaped before. The boss, he wants her back. Martin's pulse roared in his ears. Fighting rings, bred for battle, a life of bloodshed. And yet, she had made it here. Somehow she had survived. She had protected her pups. She had waited at his door, despite everything she had been through, despite everything humans had done to her. And now, they wanted her back. Martin's grip tightened. No. The man frowned. What? Martin's voice came out calm, deadly. I said no. The shepherd released her hold, stepping beside him, her body pressed close. Martin turned to Stephen. Call the police. Stephen didn't hesitate. The intruder's eyes widened. You don't understand. If you turn us in, he'll come for you next. Martin's lips curled into a humorless smile. Let him try. By the time the police arrived, the intruders had been restrained. But Martin knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As the flashing lights filled the estate, as officers led the men away in cuffs, Martin turned toward the shepherd. She was watching him. No longer just wary, no longer just waiting. She trusted him. And Martin knew he wasn't letting her go. She had survived the darkest parts of humanity. And now, she had a home, a family. And if anyone came for her again, Martin would be ready, bottom of form. The storm had passed, leaving the estate draped in thick, undisturbed snow. But inside, Martin Holloway's world had changed forever. The shepherd and her pups were still in his study, curled up beside the roaring fire. Their presence no longer felt foreign or intrusive. It felt right. The police had taken the intruders away hours ago. Stephen had doubled security, ensuring the estate was locked down tight. But Martin knew better than to believe this was over. The men would come back. Or worse, the man who owned them would. But that didn't matter. Because he wasn't giving her back. Martin stood in the doorway, watching the shepherd as she lifted her head, her golden eyes locking onto his. She no longer looked at him with caution. She trusted him. And that meant everything. Martin had spent his life building a world where nothing could touch him. He had climbed his way to the top, hardened himself against loss, made sure no one had the power to hurt him again. But then she had come to his door. She had stood in the snow, not begging, not demanding, just waiting. And he had made a choice, to let her in, to protect her, and in doing so, she had saved him too. For the first time in years, his house felt like a home. The emptiness, the silence, it was gone, replaced by the soft sound of paws against the hardwood floor, the quiet breathing of the pups nestled in their mother's warmth. Martin knelt beside the shepherd, reaching out. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She pressed her nose into his palm. A small, broken exhale escaped him. He ran his fingers gently along her fur, feeling the strength beneath it, the resilience that had brought her here. You're safe now, he murmured. For the first time, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in peace. Stephen entered the room, clearing his throat. Sir, the police confirmed that the men are connected to an underground ring operating outside the city. They won't talk, yet, but the authorities are digging. Martin's jaw clenched. It won't be enough. Their boss will come looking. Stephen nodded. Then we prepare. Martin looked down at the shepherd. She had fought her whole life to escape a world that had tried to break her. And now she had an army behind her. He wouldn't let her fight alone ever again. Have the legal team draft the papers, Martin said. She's mine now. Stephen smirked. Already ahead of you. That night, as the fire burned low, Martin sat beside the shepherd, one of the pups curled up against his leg. He had spent years closing himself off, convinced that nothing in this world was worth holding on to. But he had been wrong. Because sometimes the most unexpected things, the things you never planned for, never thought you needed, are the things that save you. And as the shepherd sighed softly, her body finally relaxing in the safety of his home, Martin knew. He had been saved too.